This is our presentation on performance studies by Taylor, Anna, and Karina.
A quick overview of performance studies is the synthesis approaches from a variety of disciplines. 4 key points are behavior, artistic practice, fieldwork or participant observation, and being actively involved in social practices and advocacies. Very simply put, performance studies looks at, examines, interprets, and analyzes all different kinds of performances: aesthetics, social, political, in sports, and what happens in daily life. You study how someone performs, how something is recorded, how it is filmed, how it is integrated into an artwork. That is performance studies, according to Richard Schechner. Before I discuss cultural and artistic performances, I should acknowledge that both of these fields cross each other's paths constantly. There's no way to really divide them, but it is 2 aspects of performance studies. So cultural performances are the occasion in which, as a culture or society, we reflect upon and define ourselves, dramatize our collective myths and history, present ourselves with alternatives, and eventually change in some ways while remaining the same in another. It is the study of dances, rituals, religious ceremonies, and/or festivals of different cultures. These practices help maintain a culture's history and customs. By studying these, anthropologists use performance studies to understand a culture within its context. Artistic performances. This is art for the sake of art, performance art, reenactment of literature, plays and storytelling, poetry reading, and elocution. The history of performance studies. Early roots of performance studies can be tied to elocution, the art of speaking. Before there was a literate populace, before radios or recorded messages, people and politicians got their ideas across via public speeches. The ability of these speakers to hold a captive audience was dependent upon their skills of speaking and were integral to persuading the audience to share their opinions. Some of these speakers, like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, would go on to change history. It could be argued that seeing this type of speaking as a performance and an art form might have set the stage for what would become the field of performance studies. A more formal history of performance studies. In the 1940s and 50s, the work of Kenneth Burke and Victor Turner explored the theater and its use of language. Embodied by social sciences such as linguistics, anthropology, and sociology, when they saw performances as a model for studying uses of language, ritual, and everyday interactions. 1960s, the avant-garde and Dada movement propelled performers, dancers not to see themselves as an image separate from the director or choreographer, but their bodies as the art. In the 1960s and 70s, civil rights, women's liberation, and anti-war protests, marches, and demonstrations showed the potential of social interaction in shaping a culture, highlighting how these marginalized populations' performances changed society. Performance studies came into academia in 1979 when NYU adopted performance studies as an academic field. In 1982, Victor Turner, an anthropologist, published From Ritual to Theater. And in 1985, Richard Schechner, a theater director and educator, published Between Theater and Anthropology. And all of these texts were integral to performance studies as we see it today.
Next, we're going to be talking about the 3 scholars that are very important in our presentation. The first is going to be Kenneth Burke, who was alive from 1897 to 1993. He was a writer with some college education, credited for the groundwork that would become performance studies. He published A Grammar of Motives in 1945, developed a system he called dramatism, language and action. It legitimates, thematizes, and performs social meanings. It is a technique of analysis of language and thought as basically modes of action rather than a means of conveying information. Introduces the idea of motion versus action. Motion is what plants do when they grow. It is involuntary, part of the natural world, whereas the movements humans choose to make, they are intentional and thus have meaning. In 1981, he received the National Medal for Literature. Next is Richard Schechner, who was born in 1934, PhD, theater director, author, performer, or professor of performance studies, editor of the Drama Review, one of the three founders of the academic field of performance studies at NYU in 1979, researched on the how of performance, asking not what does it mean, but what does it do, stresses the efficacy of performances, its capability to feed back into the transform social life, has written numerous books on performance theory and studies, and collaborated with anthropologist Victor Turner. And the third one is Peggy Phelan, who studied at Stanford University. She wrote more than 6 articles and essays in scholarly, artistic, and commercial magazines, edited special issues of the journal Narrative and Women in Performance, and she also has been the president of Performance Studies International and has been a fellow of the Getty Research Institute and Guggenheim Fellow.
So disciplines in dialogue. So suspicious of established disciplines and of the establishment of performance, scholars came to see their place as necessarily between conventional fields of study. So this means while theater and anthropology certainly played a role in the generative disciplines of performance studies, other points of contact have also had exceptional force in the field. Moreover, many of these points of contact are instrumental to the future of the field, not because theater and anthropology have ended, but because of the function and force of those disciplines that have been so thoroughly revised in the past 2 decades, says Peggy Phelan in The Ends of Performance, showing the ramifications of the discipline in the dialogue. So the different kinds of performances we have are modern dance, ballet, tap, hip hop, freestyle, opera, orchestra, musical theater, civil rights marches, labor strikes, live theater, which is wherever, and a quote by Henry Bile. So performance studies has a huge appetite for encountering, even inventing new kinds of performing. So the methods and practice are cohesive. As a method of studying performances, this new discipline is still in its formative stage, says Richard Schechner. So one is performance. Any action that is not for the first time, that has been learned, rehearsed, and is then twice behaved or performed. PS scholars claim that any action that follows is a performative paradigm, even those we typically assume are natural or spontaneous. Scholars study how the behavior is prepared and presented as a means to understand an individual's or group's values and organization. Play. This is often the thought of spontaneous or unplanned aspect of any given performance, an element of surprise or freedom that can be prescribed. So Henry Bile writes, where ritual depends on repetition, play stresses innovation and creativity. Some scholars formulate performances as the product of structured ritual plus it's unbounded. So liminal plays the part of the in-between. It's the heightened intensity in which a ritual or performance is enacted. The liminal space is the one that occupies the scholar's attention because it's there and has the potential of behavior, action, or event it is achieving. This means that the PS scholar understands itself as liminal, always between two other fields, a site where new and transformative insight can be found. So along with interdisciplinary, that's a mode of inquiry that is genre blurring, that tends to overlap in academic disciplines or departments. It's highly interdisciplinary, and it openly challenges rigid binaries instead of seeing an underlying performativity to all actions, whether verbal, written, or physical. It can thus study literature, technology, dance, everyday life, religion, sports, gender identity, all examples of performative behavior alongside one another. So theatrical means that although these words obviously derive their meaning from the worlds of performance and theater, they can also be abstracted from the performing arts and then applied to any and all aspects of human life. Performative acts like gender language have features that are structured like performance. Looking into performance studies' role in contemporary society, we have this quote: as a field, performance studies is sympathetic to the avant-garde, the marginal, the offbeat, the minoritarian, the subversive, the twisted, the queer, people of color, and the formerly colonized. It projects within performance studies often act on or act against settled hierarchies of ideas, organizations, and people. Therefore, it is hard to imagine performance studies getting its act together or settling down or even wanting to, says Richard Schechner. This quote illustrates the role of performance studies in our culture and lives. It is not necessarily interested in the mainstream, but those who live on the fringes of society and are often ignored. Inclusivity in performance studies. So textualism is the emphasis on what can be written down. So unfairly devalues the knowledge and experience of many subjugated people, says Henry Weil. The emphasis on performance in performance studies gives a voice to those unable to contextualize their thoughts in written form. By doing so, it acknowledges those the academic world might miss because it's not found in a book. So this includes the roles of everyone. Performance studies does not just explore the writer of the material being performed, but also the role of performers, choreographers, the set design, the rehearsal processes, and the space in which it is being performed. By doing so, it brings focus to those behind the scenes and their importance.
So lastly, we have our activity. So what we're asking to do is use Schechner's definition of performance, and then we're asking what is something that you did not previously think was a performance and now view it as such. Does this performance have a cultural significance to you? Do you agree with Schechner's definition of the word? His definition is any action that is not for the first time, that has been learned, rehearsed, and is then twice behaved or performed. And then we ask if you could please post your response in the discussion board. Thank you.